They say every family has secrets, whispers tucked into attics, folded away in yellowing letters, or buried beneath polished gravestones. But some secrets are darker, some are so tangled in shame and obsession that they cannot be spoken aloud without feeling like you've brushed against something unholy. This is not a tale of distant royals or forgotten monarchs. It happened here, in America, hidden in plain sight. A family whose name once stood for respect, prosperity, and community. Until behind closed doors, that name became synonymous with betrayal, forbidden desire, and the kind of silence that rots generations from within. It begins, as many tragedies do, with love. At least what the world thought was love. A marriage that should have been ordinary, even celebrated in the eyes of neighbors. But behind the curtains of the family home, love twisted into possession. What was supposed to unite became a weapon, and what should have nurtured life instead fed obsession. The details of this marriage scandal were so carefully scrubbed from the public eye that for decades it was mentioned only in broken fragments, church gossip, a passing rumor, an unfinished sentence cut short at family gatherings. But the truth has a way of bleeding through, and when it does, it demands to be faced. What I'm about to share with you is not a folktale. It is a record of choices made by people who could not escape their own blood. A father who looked at his daughter not with paternal protection, but with hunger. A daughter who was raised not to resist, but to obey. And a family that would rather close ranks, keeping the darkness within, than expose themselves to the shame of the outside world. This was not a single act of sin. It was a covenant built on silence. A marriage that was never meant to be blessed, but was instead forced, concealed, and carried on beneath a veneer of respectability. And in this story, it is not only the guilty who bear the scars. It is the children born into the lie, the grandchildren who carry names that no longer feel like their own, and the generations who are haunted by a family tree that bends back on itself, suffocating the very bloodline it was meant to preserve. This is one of America's darkest family marriage scandals, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The family at the center of this scandal lived in a world where appearances mattered more than truth. On Sundays, they were the picture of respectability, sitting neatly in the same pew, their heads bowed in piety. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. To them, the family name carried weight, the kind of name that came with land, money, and a certain quiet power in their community. But power, when turned inward, can be as suffocating as it is commanding. The story begins with the patriarch, a man outwardly respectable, a provider, someone trusted with the keys to the church doors and the ledgers of the town. But behind his carefully polished image lay a hunger that would consume everything in its path. To outsiders, his daughter was a shy young woman, obedient, soft-spoken. To him, she was something else entirely. She was not just his daughter, she was his chosen. What began as whispers behind closed doors grew into something that could no longer be hidden. The walls of the house, once filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, now carried the weight of a secret union. At first it seemed impossible. How could such a thing happen in plain sight? But in a society built on silence, where women were told their worth came from obedience, and where men's actions were rarely questioned, the unthinkable could become reality. The daughter was forced into a marriage not of her choosing, not with a man outside the family, but with her own father. The union was cloaked in secrecy, denied to the public, yet accepted within the walls of the household as something not to be questioned. And when the first child was born, the town looked on with smiles, never realizing that the child carried not just a name, but a curse written in their very blood. This is where the horror deepens. Because the scandal was not a single moment of transgression, it was institutionalized within the family itself. Year after year, birth after birth, the bloodline coiled back on itself until even the children could not untangle who was parent, who was sibling, who was spouse. The family tree became less a tree and more a knot tied with secrecy, shame, and an unholy binding that no one dared to cut loose. And while neighbors admired the family's discipline, their strength, their closeness, they never understood the real reason why the doors stayed closed, why the curtains were always drawn, why the children never quite looked at their father the way other children did. When we peel back the surface, the true weight of this scandal isn't just the violation of marriage, it's the way silence became law. Everyone in the household knew. The mother, once a young bride herself, had long ago learned that survival depended on complicity. She looked the other way, convincing herself that if she kept the home tidy, if she said nothing, if she maintained appearances, then perhaps the shame would never find her. Her silence was her shield, though it was also her curse. The children were raised in a web of contradictions. To the world, they were just another large American family. But within the walls of that home, they were witnesses and participants in something they could never name. Some grew up confused, not knowing where the boundaries of kinship ended and something darker began. Others grew hardened, learning early that speaking out was not an option, that disobedience carried consequences worse than the acts themselves. The father, meanwhile, wrapped himself in a twisted scripture. He justified his actions by reaching into the oldest pages of the Bible, pulling verses out of context, and reshaping them into a weapon. To him, this was not sin, it was destiny. He told his daughter that she was chosen by God to continue a pure bloodline, that theirs was a holy covenant misunderstood by outsiders. He poisoned the sacred into the profane until she no longer knew where faith ended and manipulation began. Neighbors began to notice oddities, but never voiced them aloud. The family rarely welcomed visitors. The children seemed unusually quiet, too careful for their age, and when illness or deformities began to appear in some of the younger offspring, whispers grew sharper, but still no one dared confront the truth. After all, in small towns, people preferred rumor to confrontation. To speak the truth would mean admitting that such darkness had lived next door all along. What makes this story unbearable is not only the act itself, but the way it endured. This was not one generation, not one mistake, but a cycle. The daughter, trapped by fear and by the psychological prison her father built, gave birth to children who would grow up in the same house, under the same roof, with the same rules of silence. For them, blood and marriage were no longer separate bonds. They were one and the same, binding them tighter than any chain could. This is where the scandal begins to reveal its true horror, because when family becomes a prison, even love itself can turn into a sentence that no one can escape. The deeper we go into this family story, the more it becomes clear that what survived was not love, not loyalty, but fear. Fear held the house together like mortar between bricks. Fear silenced questions before they could be spoken, and fear made sure that even those who suspected the truth outside the family walls never dared to name it aloud. For the daughter, who had once been a child herself, the transformation into wife and mother under her father's command was a slow kind of death. She did not laugh freely. She did not dream of a future beyond her home. She did not even dare to imagine another life. Instead, she was taught to believe that her suffering was necessary, that it was her burden to carry, and that resistance would destroy not only her, but every soul bound to her blood. The tragedy is that she came to believe it. Generations were marked by this silence. The children who grew up under this unnatural arrangement carried an invisible weight. Some tried to leave, but were pulled back by shame, by dependency, by the crushing knowledge that to speak of what happened would not only expose themselves, but damn their entire bloodline. Others accepted it quietly, repeating the same cycle, believing it was fate carved into their name. The curse of silence was passed down as surely as the family's land and possessions. By the time the scandal reached its breaking point, it had already poisoned multiple generations. Relatives who tried to untangle the family history found gaps, marriage certificates that didn't match, children whose parentage seemed blurred, dates that made no sense, but instead of raising questions, they folded these discrepancies into silence. To question was to confront something monstrous, and most people preferred to let the monster sleep. The real horror is not in the single act of incestuous marriage, it is in the normalization of it. The Away an entire family, and by extension, an entire community, chose blindness over confrontation. A family tree that bent back onto itself again and again until it no longer resembled a tree at all, just a tangle of names, births, and secrets bound by shame. And here lies the haunting truth. Once corruption enters the bloodline, it doesn't simply vanish. It lingers, twisting every branch that grows after, a reminder that silence has its own inheritance. By now you might be asking yourself, how could something like this go on for so long without exposure? The answer is unsettlingly simple. Families like this survived because the world around them allowed it. The neighbors who whispered but never intervened, the churches that preached purity while closing their doors to inconvenient truths, the authorities who looked away when the family name carried too much weight to question. Silence didn't just exist inside the household. It spread outward, covering the entire community like a heavy fog. But inside the home, silence was not just absence of sound. It was active. It was enforced. Children were taught from the earliest age that family loyalty was survival, that to speak of what happened was betrayal, a betrayal that would bring punishment not just from their father, but from God himself. That belief carved itself into their minds until even thinking of escape filled them with guilt and terror. And yet, the cracks began to show. Some children grew restless, some looked at their bloodline and felt the sickness in it, the wrongness that no scripture could erase. A few left, carrying their silence with them, but they never returned. Others, broken by the weight of what they'd seen and lived, turned to self-destruction, drinking, violence, even madness. For them, the family curse was not a legend. It was something alive, breathing down their necks, whispering that there was no way out. The father, aging but still commanding, clung to his authority as long as he could. He wore his respectability like armor, but inside the house he ruled with fear. His power did not come only from physical control, it came from the psychology of imprisonment. By making his children believe that they were chosen, that their lives were part of a divine secret, he made sure they carried the weight of his sin willingly. That was his most sinister, a victory. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent to survive, or would you have risked everything to tear the truth into the light? Because here is where the scandal begins to shift. Secrets like these never stay buried forever, and when the cracks widened beyond repair, the truth began to leak out, threatening to destroy not just the guilty but everyone who carried their name. The unraveling did not come with a confession, nor with a sudden act of courage. It came slowly, like rot pushing through old wood. It began with questions that could no longer be ignored. Birth records that didn't add up. Children whose features carried uncanny resemblances, not to distant cousins, but to their own grandfather. A story too tangled to be explained away with coincidence. One child, grown into adulthood, broke the chain of silence. The details of how are fragmented. Some say it came out in a burst of anger, others in a whispered confession too heavy to carry alone. What matters is that the words were finally spoken, words that cracked the family's armor and revealed the truth beneath. And once spoken, they could not be taken back. The community that had once prided itself on appearances could no longer ignore what stood in front of them. The whispers became accusations, the rumors became evidence. Some tried to bury it again, insisting it was just malicious talk, but others began to see the signs they had ignored for decades. The family's carefully built reputation collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a slow, crushing implosion. For the children, the truth brought no relief. To speak what had been unspeakable did not free them. It condemned them to a different kind of prison. They were now marked, not only by what had been done to them, but by the legacy of shame. In small towns, bloodlines are everything, and once a bloodline is cursed, it follows every descendant. Jobs were harder to get, marriages harder to make. Neighbors who had once smiled now looked away. The father, the architect of the scandal, went to his grave unrepentant. To the end, he denied wrongdoing, convinced that what he had done was righteous, chosen, ordained. His daughter, who had been his victim and his wife, faded into obscurity. Some say she lost her mind. Others believe she simply gave up living long before her body followed. What remains is the shadow, stretching across generations. Children who grew up twisted by a love that was never real. Grandchildren who struggled with the burden of carrying a name that no longer felt like theirs, and an unspoken reminder that the sins of one generation, when buried instead of confronted, have the power to curse every branch that grows from that poisoned root. When we stand back and look at the story as a whole, it feels less like history and more like a wound that never healed. A family torn apart not just by one man's corruption, but by the silence that followed it. Silence from the mother who could not protect, silence from the children who were taught fear, silence from neighbors who suspected but never spoke, and silence from a community that chose reputation over truth. This is why family scandals like this one linger in the shadows of America's past. They are not simply crimes, they are inheritances. They pass from parent to child like heirlooms, leaving scars you cannot see, but that shape every decision, every relationship, every attempt at love. And even when the original figures are long gone, their choices echo in whispered warnings, in broken trust, in a family name that no longer opens doors, but closes them. The horror of this story is not only in what was done, but in how ordinary it appeared to the outside world. That is why it chills us, because if such darkness can live quietly inside a respectable home, behind the smiles of Sunday mornings and the neat rows of children on the church bench, then it means the line between safety and nightmare is thinner than any of us want to believe. The family at the heart of this scandal is not alone. Their story is one of many hidden beneath layers of denial and shame across America, each one a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it calls itself love. And so the question lingers, heavier than the details of the scandal itself. How much do we really know about the families around us? How many houses with tidy lawns hold secrets that will never be spoken? How many names in our own bloodlines hide stories we were never meant to uncover? You've walked with me through one of the darkest family marriage scandals buried in American soil. You weren't supposed to hear this, but now you have. And once the truth is heard, it does not go silent again. It stays. It waits. And it asks a question that may haunt you long after this story ends. If such a thing could happen in their home, what shadows might already be living in yours?